There's so many needs out there to be filled. And so for me, service is really about just opening up your heart and let it lead you to the area that you feel strongly about, that you feel passionately about. And the gifts that you have will just come to the surface, and you'll be able to get in there and get done the things that need to be done. I've been doing trauma work with survivors primarily of domestic violence and sexual violence for 22 years in our community. And about 10 years ago started doing disaster relief with the Red Cross, working with survivors of the Oklahoma City bombing and survivors of natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, survivors of the September 11th bombing in New York, and knew that I just wanted to provide support, mental health support for those trauma survivors in a humanitarian aid context. So I started looking at the organizations that were out there doing work, and in the area of mental health, Doctors Without Borders is really doing some great things. One of the things I like about Doctors Without Borders is that they're very focused. They want to address people's medical needs in conflict situations and in natural disaster situations. But what they've come to realize over the years is that when people have been through a trauma, there are a lot of somatic, physical manifestations of the trauma, and so they come to the clinic with all of these symptoms that have nothing to do with any physical injury. And so for the past 5-6 years, they've really been seeing the need to offer mental health support in conjunction with the medical support that they provide. One of the things that surprised and comforted me was the fact that when I was sitting with a victim in Darfur, and there's a lot of sexual violence that happens. It's a conflict zone, and whenever you have war, rape is used as a weapon of war. And so I've done a lot of work here with rape survivors, so I understand that in this context. There, women have to go leave the IDP camp, the refugee camp, to find firewood, because that's how they cook their meals. When they leave to go collect the firewood, they're at risk because the militia are just waiting for them. They know they have to leave the camp, so they target those women, they rape them, they send them back to the camp. And they do it very systematically. They do it as a means of ethnic cleansing, and they do it as a means of breaking down the social and moral fabric of the community. So what I found when I was sitting in my little tukul, a little grass hut, talking with these women who had been raped, was that they were responding in the same way that women respond when I'm speaking to them at Memorial Hospital. The trauma is the same, the reaction is the same, and so the way, as human beings, the way our minds deal with trauma and the physical reactions that we have, all of that is very similar. Now, of course, there are some cultural issues that you have to deal with, but it was a bit comforting to me because I know how to deal with that kind of trauma. The Arab tribes have been armed by the Sudanese government and are systematically trying to wipe out the Black African population to make room for their herds so that they can graze their herds on the land, because the Sahara is advancing. And so their traditional grazing lands are being lost, and they need to move into these areas where the Black African tribes have traditionally lived. In Darfur, you have to have the written permission of either your father or your husband, your closest male relative, to travel to the next village. So, you know, the thought of leaving your country is just, you know, it just doesn't make sense. One of the things that I was acutely aware of, and I worked in the context with a lot of other Western expats, a lot of Brits and Germans and Finns and, you know, all sorts of different folks. And one of the things that surprised me was how very much all of us Westerners, but especially Americans, are looked upon by the world as sort of saviors. And just our presence, just us being there is extraordinarily meaningful to them. Because they feel lost, they feel abandoned, they feel like the world doesn't care about them. And so in terms of service, you asked that earlier, one of the things I've realized is that just being there, just being with someone, whether you're talking about an individual or a group of people, is extraordinarily powerful, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But in the refugee camp, they would, because there's not a lot to do in a refugee camp, right? And so occasionally there would be these spontaneous parades, and you'd see these signs. They'd take paper from, a UN organization like UNICEF school or something, and they'd make these signs saying, "We love the USA," and they march around the camp with those signs. Don't just show up. You really have to be part of an internationally recognized aid organization that's done a lot of talking with government at the highest level before you can get your visa to get into the country. And one of the things I learned on my second trip was that getting in is one thing, but getting out is another. It's one of the few countries in the world where you actually have to have an exit visa. They have to give you permission to leave. So my exit visa was held up for about 30 days. It was my second trip to Darfur. And because it was my second trip, I think that raised a red flag for the government, and I got watch listed. And so what happened was they would monitor my phone calls and my emails. I was followed. I was told, on what streets I could walk. They wouldn't give me my work permits. I was told I couldn't work. I couldn't type type on my computer. I was forbidden to do anything related to the job that I was supposed to be there doing. I was detained and questioned, and
by whom?
By the government.
By the government.
Yeah. HAC, actually. HAC, this is, I think, quite ironic. It stands for Humanitarian Affairs Commission. It's the division of government in Darfur, Sudan, that's supposed to be making it easier, helping aid workers accomplish their mission. But I have to tell you that there are a lot of hacks in HAC, and they didn't make it easy. I was identified for two reasons. One was that I made a second trip back with a different organization, and that raised a red flag. And the other was just that at that time, the IRC, International Rescue Committee, had been ID'd by the Sudanese government. They would just choose one NGO and pick on them, and that happened to be the NGO. So a number of us, primarily Americans, were watch listed. I always try and put myself in their position and understand where they're coming from and why it is that they're engaging in that behavior as best I can, given my limited view of knowledge, and then validate the feeling around that I think is coming up. And if you can do that and make that kind of a connection, it's very helpful. They just, that goes away pretty quickly. It's a very hard thing to do, and certainly when you're with Doctors Without Borders, that's something they emphasize is our neutrality and impartiality, that we're here to help. We're here to provide medical and mental health assistance to anyone who needs it. And that's all we want to do. We don't want to get involved in the politics here. We aren't taking sides. We're not saying somebody's bad and somebody's good. We're just here to do our job. I think that as Americans, it's important for us to understand the responsibility that we have to the rest of the world, because we are so blessed and we have so much. And I think it's so nice that we have the opportunity to give back. There were literally dozens of humanitarian aid organizations doing work in Sudan. And so if you're interested in education, if you're interested in providing medical support, if you're interested in helping women get involved in income generating activities, there is an aid organization that's doing that. If people are interested in donating to Doctors Without Borders, you can go to www.doctorswithoutborders.com, and you can check out the website about volunteer opportunities as well as opportunities to give monetarily. And locally, if you're interested in supporting an organization in your own community, TESSA deals with domestic violence and sexual violence victims, and they are always in need of volunteers, money, and donations.